Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for joining us. Well, will Americans become more bilingual? Maybe put another way, should they become more bilingual? But first, my special guest, the House Republican leader, Representative Bryan Cutler, joins me, and we'll be back after these words.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about politics and government to start the program, and then we're going to get to bilingual education. We're delighted to have the House Republican leader, Representative Bryan Cutler. He's the 100th House District in, I'll say it, Peach Bottom, Pennsylvania. And Representative Cutler's been on the show before. I want to point out that we had the Speaker of the House, a Democrat, on a couple of weeks ago, and we try to balance Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservative, business and labor. We can't do it over every show, but we do it over time. Representative Cutler, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Dr. Madonna.
I'll tell you what, it has to be very complicated right now in the State House of Representatives, where the Democrats have, and you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, it can change day by day, a one-seat majority. But here's what's interesting. We've had Republicans and Democrats on, liberals and conservatives, as I pointed out, and what's fascinating about this is the language being employed is a lot different. It's, well, we may not agree, but let's sit down and talk. And that was true when I had Republican leader in the House, Scott Martin, on the program. It's true when I've had Democrats on. Am I missing something here?
No, I think you're hitting the nail right on the head, actually. And I'll go back in time a little bit. I think a lot of times that language and that kind of communication is always there. When I was leader in the 1920 session, which obviously wasn't an easy political time, that was COVID and the 2020 election, right, we still had 96% of our bills were bipartisan and 65% were unanimous. At the end of the day, the voters just expect us to work together, and I think that that's a reasonable expectation, and more importantly, I think it's achievable.
Yeah. Well, I've talked about this before, and I really would like to get your opinion on it. In the past, it seemed that lawmakers did more together. They spent time with each other's families. They had lunches, they had dinners. They played sports. They even took vacations together. Over the last decade or so, that seems to have diminished, I won't say completely, but substantially. Is that true?
Yeah, I've noticed that myself. That was actually an issue that I raised when I was Speaker last session. And I think the COVID shutdowns actually accelerated that. We've actually had 3 classes now that didn't have joint orientation. They didn't have joint dinners together. And I think sometimes it's easier, particularly on social media, when there's a little bit of a distance there, it's a little easier to say something less than kind when you don't personally know the person. It's one of the reasons why I had Judge Brandon Newman come back and swear me in both times. A lot of folks might not know he's a Democrat from Washington County, and when I was sworn in as Speaker, I wanted him to be the person because we sat next to each other for an entire term on the floor, and we were very good friends. We've been to each other's homes when we've spent a lot of time together, like you just outlined.
This is important. This is
absolutely important
in terms the relationships lead to the big C word, compromise.
That's correct. We would not have had those bills that I referenced earlier, 96% bipartisan, 65% unanimous, but for those relationships as all the people work together on the issues.
Well, let's move forward and talk about an issue. We've been dealing with the new governor, Josh Shapiro's budget, for about $44 billion. It's been pretty widely well received by both Democrats and Republicans. Now, I'm not saying there aren't some differences. $44 billion, obviously there's a substantial surplus. We still have federal government, Fed's money in here as well. What do you think are the big areas of agreement? We'll get to disagreement in a minute.
Sure. I think some of the areas of agreement really are consistent with where we were, quite honestly, with Governor Wolf. Workforce development and education, making sure that, we continue to develop that first-class workforce here in the Commonwealth. I think you're going to see some targeted investments in terms of our economy, because a thriving economy will help everybody. And I think that you're also going to see some areas, what I'll call government efficiency. And, that could be running programs a little more, efficient or better for the constituents or the consumers who need them. And I think that there are plenty of areas where we could improve, and we'll just keep focusing on those.
Yeah. And obviously, the folks in basic education, K through 12, 10% hike, on special ed, 7% hike. So it seems that that's been pretty well received. We got to run to a break. When we come back, I'll let you respond to that back after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
All right, I'm chatting with the House Republican leader, Bryan Cutler, from the 100th District. He is the Republican leader in the House, as I've indicated on several occasions. All right, let's talk a little bit about the education budget. That seems, except for the public universities, that the recommendation was only 2%. I have to bring it up as somebody connected to at least one of them, Millersville, but I point that out that I may be a little biased on the funding for them, so I'll get that out. But go ahead. I mean, it looks like that education side of the budget was well received.
Yeah, well, look, we all understand that special education costs continue to rise.
Yeah.
We also recognize some of the other challenges in the education lines, the biggest of which is the unfunded pension liability.
Yeah.
We were on track prior to the most recent market downturn, actually getting a decrease in terms of our allocation of those costs. It's my hope as the market returns that that'll improve, and that would be a direct impact on property taxes at that point. But as long as the other cost drivers continue to go up, like special education, we're going to have to continue to address that and make sure that we really get the best delivery and the education for each individual student. It really needs to be individually tailored to get the best results. And we've worked on some legislation in that world, and I think you're going to keep seeing some efforts there as well, because at the end of the day, it's really about turning out an opportunity for students to learn and then ultimately be successful.
Now, what do you think will be the biggest differences in terms of the budget recommendation? I'm talking about the issue side, the policy side, between D's and R's.
Yeah, I think the biggest one that really jumped out right out of the gate was the fact that if you run these numbers out over 3, 4, and 5 years, the surplus quickly disappears, and as well as the rainy day fund. It took us 12 years with working with Governor Wolf and the Republican legislature to save that money up, and we have to strike a balance between responsible investments and then also saving for future dips or bumps that are in the economic road. It's well documented that we're likely facing a recession coming soon, which means revenues would drop. So to the extent that we can smooth that out as best as possible, I think we have to be responsible.
Is there any areas that you would cite policy issues in the budget?
Yeah, some other policy issues. I'm not sure that they're the best areas to put investments. Honestly, I think his budget really had something for everybody. So there's parts that we all like. There's parts that both sides might be a little bit hesitant about. But the overall spend, which is I would kind of put in the bucket of financial policy, is probably the biggest concern that I've heard about.
All right. If you sat down with Governor Shapiro, and I'm sure you've chatted with
We have.
What would you say are the 2 or 3 things that you would most want him to emphasize and support?
Well, I think we have to make it easier to do business here in Pennsylvania. So hearing him talk about reforming the permitting process, for example, I think is huge. He's also advocated for improving the financial climate for businesses with, our corporate net income tax and our tax structure. I think those are both good to really build the pillar of the thriving economy. But in order to have a thriving economy, we have to keep focusing on the workforce. So that's going to be some career and technical and trade type jobs. We need to continue to invest there as well. And we're really seeing a shift of students choosing those careers perhaps over a 4-year college degree. That's something I myself did. I went to trade school first. Well, it was an X-ray tech, and then ultimately got my undergrad from Lebanon Valley, but that was not a direct path for me. And so I had a working degree, and then I was able to finish my college degree.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting. The other thing with surplus, and you make the point about in the out years it goes away, about whether the budget gets done by the magic date, June 30?
June 30, yes, sir.
Does it get done? I'm putting you on the spot.
Well, it should. I've actually raised my hand. I'm a little worried because, when you look back at the other years, we were already working on some of the foundational bills for the budget. We call them code vehicles, the education code and the human services code and the budget-related vehicles. Those bills have been a little slow out of the gate, so if they don't move in the next week or two, I am worried that we might not hit the June 30th deadline.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on the program. You're welcome anytime. All right. Should Americans become more bilingual? We'll check in on that soon.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, go to ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
All right, should America become more bilingual? We're going to get into that with our guest, Andrea Bitner. She's the English language learner teacher. That's quite a title, isn't it?
Thank you. Yes, it is.
And you're the author of a book. We'll get to that in a minute. All right. Okay, for all of us, what's bilingual education?
Yes, so bilingual education can take on many different forms throughout the country, but really what it means is a person who was born or possibly not born here, who speaks another language and is also learning English. And we are teachers that get to work with these amazing kids who are in that process.
Yeah, I mean, I always thought being bilingual was very important, but in America, regardless of what country you came from, you really ultimately have to learn English, it seems to me, or am I being too parochial about it?
Absolutely. That opportunity is there. And most of the students that we work with now and families are born here in the U.S. So their first practice of English is when they arrive in our school buildings. So yes, the opportunity to become bilingual in America is definitely well and alive.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about bilingual education, what does that consist of?
So that consists of teachers who work with students in reading, writing, and listening and speaking of English. So students come to us with many different proficiency levels and many different experiences, but when they arrive at school, we have the tools that we need to figure out what skills they need to work on.
And what does that actually mean when you go into a school? So what you're saying is this bilingual education takes place in school districts throughout Pennsylvania and the country as well, correct?
Yes, it does. It's when students arrive at school, their parents fill out what's called a home language survey. And that's a survey that every student, and every parent, including myself, fill out for your children when you register them. And as soon as you register them, they have the opportunity to check off if other languages are spoken at home. And when we receive that indicator, the EL teachers start to investigate what services that student may or may not need.
Yeah. And this obviously involves much more than just learning the language. You have to do something, you have to have an understanding of the culture in which these young folks come from?
Absolutely. You know, as EL teachers, I like to say we wear a lot of hats. We are not only instructors, but we're also navigators and connectors. We are instructing our students daily in English in those skills, but I like to say we live in the city and not necessarily on the block. We're moving between groups, we're moving between grade levels, we're moving between buildings, and we're working with all of the teachers in the building to help them learn how to best support the students. In addition to that, we're connecting our students, not only to each other, but out in the community as well.
Yeah. And so are there courses that you would take in, let's say, in getting your teaching certificate, you know, your teacher education at a 4-year, undergraduate institution to train you to do this?
Yes. So you have the opportunity to become an EL teacher. There are lots of programs, undergraduate programs and master's programs that allow you to do that around the country. Or if you don't start out as an EL teacher, it can be an additional certification and study that you do later on.
Now, do a lot of people do that? They move from whatever subject matter they had into bilingual education?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what I did. I started out as a high school English teacher, then I became a Title I reading specialist, and then I became an English language learner teacher. So my trajectory did not start out as an EL teacher.
Now, is there a shortage of bilingual educators? I would think there probably would be, given.
So, yeah, I mean, there's a shortage of educators everywhere, but yes, we are always looking to add more bilingual educators to our teams.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's run to a break. When we come back, I want to talk. You also wrote a book called Take Me Home.
Yes.
Obviously, that involves culture as well as the language. Is that correct?
It does.
All right, back after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine.
All right, Andrea Bitner is my guest. She's written a book called Take Me Home. Obviously, we've been doing with bilingual education. Take Me Home. I'll tell you, just from the title, Take Me Home has to be about the culture and the environment in which the folks who, need bilingual education have come from, have arrived here from. Do I got that correct?
I mean, yes, it's such an important piece, as part of our book. And I can tell you a little bit about, where that came from and how that got started.
Well, please do.
Absolutely. So I've been working in education for about 23 years. And about 16 years ago, I started working with English language learners. And I had this really special group of students, about 40 of them at the high school level. And they came from all different walks of life. I had kids who were born here. I had kids who had crossed the border. I had kids who had waited 10 years for a visa and came after their parents. I had kids that had come before their parents and mom and dad had joined them later. I had kids from exchange students and adopted students. So we had this diverse group of kids. And so one thing that they had in common was this big classroom banner. And it said, education is freedom. Education is opportunity. What's your plan?
And we had some photographs, by the way.
Fantastic.
Students.
Awesome. I love those guys. And so we had this classroom banner that our kids would get to participate in our program and sign and move on into this wonderful bilingual world that was waiting for them.
But how do you do 40 students in the same class? Did you say you did 40 students? How can you do that?
As EL teachers, we don't see them all at the same time.
Oh, good.
We switch periods throughout the day in different grade levels and different proficiency levels, for sure.
And obviously, you could run to a situation where the bilingual students come from different countries and therefore speak different languages. Is that correct?
It does. And where I come from in Interborough, we have about 30 different languages within
30?
Yes, within hundreds of students that we work with throughout the district. And that's not uncommon to have many different.
Would the largest be Hispanic?
No, not in our district in particular. Our largest are Arabic, Cambodian, and Spanish is part of that as well, but it's not our largest. Every district is really different.
I have no idea how you could do this.
Well, just like people train to be different jobs in life, we've been trained with the lens of how do I teach kids that come from different places or are born here and need to learn those skills in English.
Yeah. And you also have to connect in a variety of ways. It's just not, can you, quote, teach bilingual education, end quote, but you also have to connect with the culture and have to have an understanding of the culture that these folks have. Is that correct?
You do. You know, I say as bilingual educators or EL educators, we are not only instructors but connectors and navigators. And part of that navigation piece and that connection piece is helping teachers and educators and other kids in the buildings and rooms understand those cultural pieces that kids walk into the door with, and learning to respect, accept, and admire all of them for what they are and where they're headed.
Yeah. And connect means not just with the students, but with you connect with their families as well?
Absolutely. Something that we really learned within our district, which is one of the reasons we wrote the PA Innovative Teaching Grant, is that our kids felt really isolated because they didn't know that there were other kids in the building who spoke similar languages to them. So we took the opportunity to start to connect them district-wide, county-wide, and building-wide, and build that.
Well, what about the book? How does the book approach bilingual education?
So the book has approached bilingual education because it's a true story of 11 of my former students who give a firsthand account of what it's really like to become bilingual in America. And it has connected with educators and teachers and bilingual students all over. It has a lot of heart behind it and inspiration, and it's teaching people the opportunities that they have to do great work for our EL kids.
Now, with these 11 students, I think, former students, does it involve what happened after their bilingual education in terms of their life thereafter, with their careers, with society as a whole? Does it involve all aspects of that?
So it gives a firsthand account of what it was like when they were arriving in this country and going through their school experiences. But the good news is that many of them are still involved with the work we're doing now. So people do get to see all of the great opportunities that have landed their way as they've graduated from college and went into the workforce.
Yeah. So you've got to have a real sense, not just of the language, but of the culture. You have to have an understanding of where these students have come from and their families. And some of them have to have, I'll put it this way, the nicest family histories, given what many of them have to go through.
Yes, I mean, as I mentioned before, many of those students have had a vast variety of experiences, and that was one of our goals in writing Take Me Home and doing this work, was to open people's eyes to all of the different places and experiences that students have encountered, because they are really different before they've come here.
Yeah, I couldn't even begin to imagine how you deal with those cultures, but you've said you sort of differentiate the cultures and try to put folks together by their cultural experiences and their language. Is that correct? We
do. We connect our kids building-wide a few times a year by taking them out into the community, allowing them to show their leadership skills and practice skills talking to different business leaders and different experiences. In addition to that, we get their parents together at various events as well.
Yeah, it's complicated, but extremely. Are your programs growing?
Absolutely. They're growing not only countywide, statewide, and all around the country.
Yeah, and hopefully. Well, look, I want to thank you for coming on. I think this has been an extremely important subject matter, and we're delighted to have you on Pennsylvania Newsmakers.
Thank you.
And you'll keep us updated. All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And as always, stay well.